Susan Miller stared at the cream-colored envelope on her desk. The royal seal caught the morning light coming through her office window. Her hands shook slightly as she picked it up again, running her fingers over the embossed golden letters. She still couldn't believe it was real. "Jack," she called to her husband, who was reading the newspaper in their living room. "Come look at this again. I still can't believe we're invited to the Royal Charity Gala." Jack Miller folded his newspaper and walked into his wife's home office with a smile. After 15 years of marriage, he still found joy in seeing Susan excited. Her fashion design business had taken off in the last few years, and this invitation proved she was finally being recognized internationally. "I believe it, honey," he said, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You deserve this. Your new line was a hit in London." Susan leaned back in her chair. "But a royal event, Jack, with actual princes and princesses and dukes and whatever else they have over there." She waved the invitation in the air. "This isn't just some fashion show. This is the annual Royal Charity Gala. Everyone who matters will be there." Jack picked up the invitation and read it again. 2 weeks from now. That doesn't give us much time to prepare." Susan jumped to her feet. "I need a new dress. I can't wear anything from my own collection. That would look desperate. And you need a new tuxedo. Your old one is at least 5 years out of style." Jack laughed. "Whatever you say, fashion expert. Just remember why we're going. This is a chance to expand your business in Europe, not just to meet famous people." Susan nodded, but her mind was already racing with thoughts of who might be at the gala. Members of the royal family for sure. Maybe famous actors or musicians, politicians, business leaders, and other designers. She needed to be prepared to recognize everyone important. For the next 2 weeks, Susan threw herself into preparations. She ordered a custom gown from a respected Italian designer, a midnight blue creation with subtle beading that caught the light when she moved. She spent hours online, studying photos of royals and celebrities, memorizing faces and names. She practiced proper etiquette for meeting members of the royal family. She even hired a coach to help her perfect her British accent, though Jack told her that was going too far. "Just be yourself," he said as they packed their suitcases the night before their flight to London. "That's who got invited, after all." Susan folded a silk scarf and placed it carefully in her bag. "Being myself got me the invitation. Being better than myself will get me connections and contracts." Jack sighed but didn't argue. When Susan set her mind to something, there was no changing it. That determination had built her business from a small operation in their garage to an international brand with boutiques in 3 American cities. Now she had her sights set on London, and the gala was her chance to make important connections. Their flight to London was long but comfortable in first class. Susan reviewed her notes on her tablet while Jack watched movies. They arrived at their hotel the day before the gala, and Susan immediately called for the concierge to press their formal wear. "Everything must be perfect," she told Jack as she inspected his tuxedo for any flaws. "First impressions are everything in this world." That evening, they attended a small dinner at their hotel, where they met a few other Americans who would be at the gala. One couple owned a tech company that had developed apps used by the royal family's charitable foundation. Another man was a famous surgeon who had pioneered a new heart surgery technique. "And what do you do?" the surgeon's wife asked Susan. Susan straightened her shoulders. "I'm a fashion designer. My brand, Miller Designs, just opened our first London location last month." "Oh, how lovely," the woman said. "I'll have to visit. We're here for another week after the gala." Susan handed her a business card. "Please do, ask for Megan, the manager. Tell her I sent you, and she'll give you the VIP treatment." The woman seemed impressed, and Susan felt a small thrill of success. This was just the beginning. Back in their hotel room, Susan could barely sleep. She kept imagining herself talking with royalty, making connections that would elevate her brand to new heights. She pictured herself being invited to design outfits for important events, maybe even for members of the royal family themselves. "You're thinking too much," Jack mumbled beside her, half asleep. "Rest now. Big day tomorrow." Susan tried to close her eyes, but her mind kept racing. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the London night. Lights twinkled across the city. Somewhere out there was the historic mansion where the gala would be held tomorrow. She imagined it filled with beautiful people in expensive clothes, all mingling and talking and making deals. "I belong there," she whispered to herself. "And after tomorrow, everyone will know it." When morning came, Susan began her preparations early. She had scheduled a hairstylist and makeup artist to come to their hotel room. Jack watched in amusement as his normally confident wife fretted over every detail. "Is this necklace too much?" she asked, holding up a diamond pendant. "I don't want to look like I'm trying too hard." Jack, already dressed in his tuxedo, kissed her cheek. "You look perfect. The necklace is elegant, not showy." By late afternoon, Susan was ready. Her gown fit perfectly, her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and her makeup enhanced her features without looking overdone. As they waited for their private car to arrive, she studied herself in the mirror one last time. "Remember what we talked about," Jack said, straightening his bow tie. "This is a charity event. Be interested in the causes they support. Ask questions about their work. Don't just talk about fashion." Susan nodded. "I know. I've researched their main charities. I'm prepared." The car arrived exactly on time, a sleek black vehicle with a uniformed driver. As they drove through London, Susan felt her nerves building. The closer they got to their destination, the more real it all became. "What if I say something wrong?" she suddenly asked Jack. "What if I use the wrong fork or curtsy incorrectly or call someone by the wrong title?" Jack took her hand. "Then you'll apologize and life will go on. No one expects Americans to get everything right. Just be respectful and genuine." The car turned through large iron gates and drove up a long driveway lined with ancient trees. At the end stood a magnificent mansion, its windows glowing with golden light. A red carpet led to the entrance, where guests in formal wear already arriving. "Oh my God," Susan whispered. "It's really happening." The car stopped at the entrance. A footman in a formal uniform opened their door and offered Susan his hand to help her out. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped onto the red carpet. The entrance hall of the mansion was even more impressive than Susan had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings painted with scenes from mythology. Marble columns supported archways leading to various rooms. Well-dressed staff directed guests toward the main ballroom, checking invitations as they went. Susan clutched her small evening bag, which contained their invitation. When they reached the staff member checking names, she proudly presented it. "Mr. and Mrs. Jack and Susan Miller," the young woman announced, checking their names on her list. "Welcome to the Royal Charity Gala. Please proceed to the ballroom for the reception." Susan felt a rush of excitement as they stepped into the ballroom. The space was filled with people in formal wear, the women in colorful gowns and sparkling jewelry, the men mostly in black tuxedos. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. "I don't see any royals yet," Susan whispered to Jack, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "They'll probably make an entrance later," Jack replied. "Let's just enjoy ourselves for now. Look, there's a famous actor over there." Susan followed his gaze and saw a well-known British actor chatting with a small group. Her heart raced. This was real. She was really here, among the elite. And soon, if all went according to plan, she would be one of them. What she didn't know was that the most important encounter of the evening would not be with any royal, but with a quiet, elderly American gentleman she was about to meet, a man whose name would change everything. Susan and Jack moved through the crowded ballroom, stopping occasionally to introduce themselves to other guests. Susan kept one eye on the main entrance, waiting for the royal family members to arrive. She sipped her champagne slowly, not wanting to become too relaxed before meeting anyone important. "The seating chart is being displayed in the side room," Jack said, pointing to where a small crowd was gathering. "Should we check where we'll be sitting for dinner?" Susan nodded eagerly. "Yes, let's see who we're seated with." They made their way to the side room where large boards displayed table assignments. Guests clustered around, searching for their names. Susan pushed forward gently, scanning the lists until she found their names at table 12. "Here we are," she said, running her finger along the list of other names at their table. Most were unfamiliar to her, though one was a British fashion editor she had met once at a show in New York. Then her finger stopped at a name that seemed oddly familiar. "Clint? Just Clint? That's strange. Most people have their full names listed." Jack shrugged. "Maybe it's someone famous who only needs one name, like Madonna or Cher." Susan laughed. "At a royal gala? I doubt it." She continued studying the other names, trying to memorize them before they returned to the ballroom. A gentle chime rang throughout the mansion, and a voice announced that dinner would be served in 15 minutes. Guests began moving toward their assigned tables. Susan and Jack found table 12, a round table set with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery. Name cards marked each place. Susan quickly found her seat and was pleased to see she was placed between Jack and the mysterious Clint. On Jack's other side was the fashion editor she recognized. The other seats began to fill with well-dressed people who introduced themselves politely. "I wonder who this Clint person is," Susan whispered to Jack. "Everyone else has arrived except for that seat." Just then, an elderly gentleman approached their table. He walked with a straight posture but moved somewhat slowly, as people in their 80s often do. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that somehow seemed more comfortable on him than on many of the younger men in the room. His face was weathered, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested years spent outdoors. "Good evening," he said in a distinctly American accent as he found his name card next to Susan. "Hope I haven't kept anyone waiting." Susan smiled politely. "Not at all. I'm Susan Miller, and this is my husband Jack." The man nodded to them both. "Nice to meet you. I'm Clint." Susan waited for him to say his last name, but he simply sat down and placed his napkin on his lap. She glanced at Jack, who shrugged slightly. "Are you from the States as well?" Susan asked, trying to place his accent more specifically. Clint nodded. "California. Been there most of my life." "We're from Chicago," Susan said. "I'm a fashion designer. My brand just opened a store here in London." "Congratulations," Clint said with a small smile. "That's quite an achievement." "Thank you," Susan replied, pleased by his recognition. "What do you do?" Clint took a sip of water. "I work in film, have for many years now." Susan's interest perked up. "Oh, as what? A producer? Director?" "Bit of both," he said. "Started as an actor, moved into directing. Still do both sometimes." Susan nodded politely, though she was a little disappointed. She had hoped to be seated next to someone more influential. An elderly American filmmaker, while respectable, wasn't the kind of connection she had been hoping to make tonight. Still, she reminded herself of Jack's advice to be genuinely interested in everyone. "Anything I might have seen?" she asked. Clint seemed to consider this question carefully. "Maybe, depends on what kind of films you enjoy." Before Susan could ask more, servers arrived with the first course, and conversation at the table turned to the food and the charitable causes supported by the gala. Susan learned that the event was raising money for children's hospitals and veteran support programs. As the meal progressed, Susan chatted with others at the table. The fashion editor recognized her name and complimented her recent collection, which thrilled Susan. She made sure to exchange contact information, hoping for a feature in the editor's magazine. Between courses, she turned back to Clint, who had been quietly eating and occasionally commenting on the conversation around him. "So, you mentioned you work in film," Susan said. "What kind of movies do you make?" Clint dabbed his mouth with his napkin. "All kinds, really. Westerns, dramas, some action films. I prefer stories with something to say." Susan nodded, though she wasn't particularly interested in westerns. They seemed old-fashioned to her. "My favorite movies are the big blockbusters with amazing special effects. And romantic comedies, of course. Nothing wrong with entertainment," Clint said mildly. "But I've always believed films can do more than just entertain. They can make people think, challenge their beliefs." "I suppose," Susan said, not entirely convinced. She had gone to a foreign film festival once and found most of the movies boring and slow. But most people go to movies to escape, not to think. That's why those big superhero movies make billions and serious dramas only play in small art theaters. Clint's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "There's room for all kinds of stories. Always has been." "I guess," Susan said, taking another sip of wine. The alcohol had made her more talkative and a bit less careful with her words. "But let's be honest, those old-style movies, especially westerns, are pretty outdated now. All those scenes of squinty-eyed tough guys not saying much and then shooting bad guys." She laughed. "Like those old Clint Eastwood movies my dad used to watch, so simple compared to what filmmakers can do now." She didn't notice how the woman across the table suddenly looked down at her plate, hiding a smile. Nor did she see how Jack, who had been talking to the fashion editor, suddenly turned with wide eyes. Clint himself just nodded thoughtfully. "Those old films do seem simple on the surface. But sometimes there's more to them than meets the eye." "Maybe," Susan said, with a slight shrug. "But that raspy voice thing and the whole tough guy act, it's just so cliché now. Everyone's done impressions of it. You know, the whole make my day thing." She attempted a gruff, masculine voice that made her laugh at her own impression. Table had grown noticeably quieter, but Susan didn't pick up on it. She was enjoying herself and feeling proud of her knowledge of film. Limited, though, it was to mainstream movies and what she remembered from her college film appreciation class. "The problem with those old westerns," she continued, warming to her topic, "is that they're so predictable. The good guy always wins, the bad guys always lose. Modern movies are much more complex, with anti-heroes and moral gray areas." "Some of those old westerns had more gray areas than you might remember," Clint said mildly. "Not everything was black and white, even back then." "I'll take your word for it," Susan said, patting his arm in a slightly condescending way. "I haven't watched one since I was a teenager. My dad loved those Clint Eastwood marathons on cable. I always thought they were so slow. And so much squinting." She laughed again and mimicked a stern, squinting expression. Jack, who had been trying to catch his wife's eye, finally managed to get her attention. He gave her a pointed look and a small shake of his head, trying to signal her to change the subject. But Susan, misinterpreting his look as simple disapproval of her talking about movies instead of fashion, just gave him a quick smile and turned back to Clint. "Sorry if I'm going on about movies," she said. "What else do you do besides film work? Do you live in London or are you just here for the gala?" "Just visiting," Clint said. "I try to support certain charities when I can. The Veterans Program here does good work." "Were you in the military?" Susan asked, genuinely curious now. Clint nodded. "Army, long time ago." Before Susan could ask more, there was a stir in the room. The main doors opened, and several men in formal suits entered, followed by a group of elegantly dressed people, who Susan immediately recognized as members of the royal family. Her heart began to race with excitement. This was what she had been waiting for all evening. "Jack, look," she whispered urgently. "They're here." All thoughts of her dinner companion forgotten, Susan straightened in her seat and smoothed her dress, hoping for a chance to meet royalty. She had no idea that the quiet, elderly man beside her would soon cause her the most embarrassing moment of her life. The royal family members moved through the ballroom, stopping at different tables to greet guests. Susan watched them with growing excitement, barely touching her dessert. She kept smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in her small compact mirror. "Do I look okay?" she whispered to Jack. "You look beautiful," he assured her, though his attention seemed divided. He kept glancing nervously at Clint, who was calmly enjoying his dessert. Susan noticed a young royal couple approaching a nearby table. "That's Prince William and his wife," she whispered excitedly to Jack. "They're coming this way next, I think." Clint looked up with mild interest but said nothing. He seemed much less impressed by the royal presence than the other guests. "Have you ever met any of the royal family before?" Susan asked him, trying to be polite while still keeping most of her attention on the approaching royals. "Once or twice," Clint said. "At events similar to this one." "Really?" Susan was surprised. Perhaps this elderly filmmaker had more connections than she had assumed. "Were you nervous?" "I'm definitely nervous." Clint gave a small smile. "Not particularly. They're just people doing a job, same as anyone else." Susan wasn't sure she agreed. With that, to her, royalty seemed like something from another world, far removed from ordinary life. But before she could say anything else, the royal couple finished at the neighboring table and began moving toward theirs. Everyone at table 12 straightened up. The fashion editor quickly checked her makeup. The businessman across from Susan adjusted his bow tie. Jack tugged at his cuffs. Only Clint seemed relaxed, watching the approaching couple with the calm interest of someone who had seen many important people in his long life. Prince William reached their table first, his wife just behind him. The table's occupants rose to their feet as they had been instructed to do in the event program. Susan's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. "Good evening," Prince William said with a warm smile. "I hope you're all enjoying yourselves." There was a chorus of polite responses. Susan tried to speak but found her mouth had gone dry with excitement. She managed a small nod instead. To her disappointment, Prince William's gaze moved past her, landing instead on the elderly man beside her. His face lit up with recognition. "Mr. Eastwood," he said warmly, extending his hand. "What a pleasure to see you again. My father mentioned he enjoyed your conversation about conservation efforts at last year's event." Susan felt the room spin slightly. She gripped the back of her chair for support. Did he just say Mr. Eastwood, as in Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? The famous actor and director whose movies he had just been mocking to his face? Jack, across the table, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The fashion editor was hiding a smile behind her hand. The other guests at the table were watching Susan with expressions ranging from amusement to sympathy. "Your Royal Highness, Clint Eastwood replied, shaking the prince's hand. "Good to see you. Again, your father's knowledge of wildlife conservation is impressive." "He'll be sorry he missed you tonight," Prince William said. "He's on a trip to Australia this week, but he asked me to convey his regards if I saw you." "Please give him mine as well," Clint said. Susan stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. She had spent the last hour criticizing Clint Eastwood's movies to Clint Eastwood himself. She had even done a mocking impression of his famous squint and raspy voice while sitting right next to him. And now she was watching him chat comfortably with Prince William as if they were old friends. The prince's wife spoke next. "Mr. Eastwood, I loved your film about the female boxer. It was so powerful." "Thank you," Clint said with a nod. "$1 Million Baby, one of my favorites too." Susan's mind raced. $1 Million Baby, of course. The film had won multiple Academy Awards. How had she not recognized one of the most famous directors and actors in Hollywood history? True, he was older now than in most of the films she remembered. But still, she should have known. Anyone should have known. Prince William turned slightly, acknowledging the rest of the table. I hope Mr. Eastwood has been keeping you all entertained with his stories. He's far too modest to share them unless prompted. Susan couldn't speak. Her face felt hot with embarrassment. Jack gave a strained smile and nodded. The royal couple moved on to the next table, leaving Susan in a state of shock. She slowly sank back into her chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Clint Eastwood. How could she face him now? The table was uncomfortably quiet for a moment. Then the fashion editor broke the silence. Mr. Eastwood, I've always wanted to ask about your process as a director. Do you plan every shot in advance, or do you prefer to find moments on set? Clint began to answer, discussing his filmmaking philosophy in his distinctively soft-spoken way. The other guests listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about his long career. Susan remained silent, staring at her plate and wishing she could disappear. Jack reached across the table and touched her hand gently. When she looked up, he gave her an encouraging smile. It didn't help much. She had made a complete fool of herself in front of a Hollywood legend, and now everyone at the table knew it. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, there was a brief lull in the conversation. Susan knew this was her chance to say something, anything to address the elephant in the room. She took a deep breath. Mr. Eastwood, she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea who you were. The table fell silent again. Everyone looked at Clint, waiting for his response. Susan braced herself for anger, or at least cold dismissal. Instead, to her surprise, Clint smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes, causing them to crinkle at the corners in that famous way she should have recognized earlier. No need to apologize, he said in that unmistakable raspy voice. It's actually refreshing to have a conversation where someone isn't afraid to speak their mind. The tension at the table broke. Several people laughed, including Jack. Susan managed a weak smile, still mortified but grateful for Eastwood's gracious response. But those things I said about your movies ... She began. Clint waved a hand dismissively. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and you're not entirely wrong about the squinting. He demonstrated the famous Eastwood squint, causing more laughter around the table. Susan laughed too, though she still felt embarrassed. I'm going to be honest, Mr. Eastwood. I haven't seen most of your films since I was a teenager watching them with my dad. I should probably give them another try as an adult. You might see them differently now, he agreed. Or you might not. That's the thing about movies, they hit everyone in different ways. The conversation gradually returned to normal, with Clint answering questions about his career and latest projects. He seemed genuinely untroubled by Susan's earlier comments, which only made her feel worse about making them. Here was a man who had won multiple Academy Awards, directed dozens of acclaimed films, and was on friendly terms with the royal family, and he was humble enough to sit quietly while she lectured him about filmmaking. As the evening progressed, Clint even introduced Susan to several people who stopped by their table to greet him. Each time, he mentioned her fashion design business, helping her make the very connections she had hoped for when she came to the gala. Your dress is beautifully made, he commented during a quiet moment. You have a good eye for detail. Thank you, Susan said, surprised and touched by the compliment. That means a lot, especially coming from someone who creates visual art for a living, Clint nodded. Different mediums, same principles. Knowing what to highlight and what to leave to the imagination. Susan considered this thoughtfully. Perhaps there were more similarities between fashion design and filmmaking than she had realized. Both were about telling stories and creating emotional responses through visual means. As the evening began to wind down, Susan found herself feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was still embarrassed about her faux pas, but also grateful for the unexpected kindness Clint Eastwood had shown her. Despite her mortification, this evening had turned out to be even more memorable than she had hoped, though not in the way she had imagined, and she knew that when she got home, the first thing she would do would be to watch some Clint Eastwood films with new eyes, starting with $1 Million Baby. The gala continued with dancing in the grand ballroom. A small orchestra played classical music, and couples moved gracefully across the polished floor. Susan sat at the table, still recovering from her embarrassment. Jack had gone to get them fresh drinks, leaving her alone with her thoughts for a moment. "May I join you?" Susan looked up to see Clint Eastwood standing beside her chair. The legendary actor had left their table earlier to speak with some other guests, and Susan had hoped that might be the end of their interaction. No such luck. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Though I'm surprised you want to talk to me after I made such a fool of myself." Clint sat down with the easy movement of someone who was comfortable in his own body despite his age. "We all say things we regret sometimes. The question is what we do afterward," Susan smiled weakly. "In my case, wish for the floor to open up and swallow me whole." This made Clint chuckle. Too drastic. Besides, it was refreshing to hear honest opinions for a change. When you've been in the business as long as I have, most people just tell you what they think you want to hear. Susan found that hard to believe, even when you're, well, you? Especially then, Clint said. Success makes it harder to get honest feedback, not easier. Jack returned with the drinks and stopped short when he saw who was sitting with his wife. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm so sorry about." Clint held up a hand. "Already forgotten. Your wife and I were just having an interesting conversation about honesty." Jack looked relieved as he set down the drinks and took a seat. Susan's always been too honest for her own good. Her business partners say it's both her best and worst quality. "Sounds about right," Susan admitted. "My mother always said I was born without a filter." "That can be an asset in creative fields," Clint said. "Helps cut through the nonsense." Susan was surprised by his kindness. She had expected him to avoid her for the rest of the evening, not seek out her company. "I still feel terrible about what I said about your films." "Don't," Clint said simply. "Film is subjective, always has been. What works for one person doesn't work for another." Susan nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "Still, I shouldn't have been so dismissive, especially when I haven't seen most of your recent work." "Tell you what," Clint said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small card and handed it to her. "My production company is having a small screening next month in New York of my newest film before its release. If you and Jack are interested, you're welcome to attend." Susan stared at the card in disbelief. Was Clint Eastwood really inviting her to a private screening after she had insulted his work to his face? "That's incredibly generous, but no buts," Clint said. "Consider it a trade. I'll show you my work, and maybe someday you can show me yours." "My work?" Susan asked, confused. "Your designs," Clint clarified. "My granddaughter is getting into fashion. She might appreciate your perspective." Jack looked as stunned as Susan felt. "We would be honored, Mr. Eastwood. Thank you." Susan nodded, still trying to process what was happening. "Yes, thank you. That's very kind." Before Clint could respond, they were interrupted by a tall, elegant woman who approached their table with purpose. Susan recognized her immediately as Vivian Moore, the editor-in-chief of one of the most prestigious fashion magazines in the world. "Clint, darling," Vivian said, leaning down to kiss Eastwood on the cheek. "I've been looking for you all evening." "Vivian," Clint greeted her warmly. "Always good to see you." Vivian glanced curiously at Susan and Jack. Clint made the introductions. This is Susan Miller, a talented fashion designer from Chicago, and her husband Jack. Susan, Jack, this is Vivian Moore. Susan felt her heart skip a beat. Vivian Moore was a legend in the fashion world, someone Susan had admired for years but never dreamed of meeting. And now Clint Eastwood was introducing them and had called her talented. Miller Designs, Vivian said, her eyes lighting with recognition. I saw your new collection last month. The blue evening gown with the asymmetrical neckline was particularly striking. Susan could hardly believe what she was hearing. You know my work? I make it my business to know promising designers, Vivian said. Your use of color is refreshing. Susan felt a surge of professional pride. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. Vivian turned to Clint. You always did have an eye for talent in all fields. Clint shrugged modestly. Susan and I were just getting acquainted. This evening, a mischievous smile played on Vivian's lips. Oh? And how did that go? Susan felt her face flush, wondering if the editor somehow knew about her embarrassing mistake. But Clint smoothly changed the subject. Susan just opened a boutique here in London, he said. You should stop by sometime. I think I will, Vivian said, turning her attention back to Susan. Where is it located? Susan gave her the address, trying to keep her voice steady despite her excitement. Vivian Moore visiting her boutique would be a major coup. It could lead to a feature in her magazine, which would catapult Miller Designs to a new level of recognition. I'll have my assistant set up a time, Vivian said. Perhaps next week? I'd love to see your full collection. That would be wonderful, Susan managed to say. I'll make sure my manager knows to expect you. Perfect. Vivian turned back to Clint. Now, darling, you promised me a dance last time we met, and I'm here to collect. Clint stood up with a good-natured smile. Can't argue with that. He nodded. To Susan and Jack, enjoy the rest of your evening. And remember what I said about the screening. As Clint led Vivian to the dance floor, Susan turned to Jack with wide eyes. Did that really just happen? Did Clint Eastwood just introduce me to Vivian Moore? Jack looked equally amazed. He sure did. And she knew your work. And he invited us to a private screening. Susan shook her head in disbelief. After I insulted his movies to his face, Jack took her hand. I think there's a lesson here about not judging people based on first impressions. Susan watched as Clint danced gracefully with Vivian, moving with surprising agility for a man of his age. He was nothing like the gruff, tough guy characters he often played on screen. In person, he was gentle, thoughtful, and incredibly kind even. To someone who had been rude to him, you know what's strange? Susan said quietly, when I got that invitation to this gala, all I could think about was making connections that would help my business. Meeting royalty, networking with influential people. But I never expected the most valuable connection would be with an American filmmaker I didn't even recognize at first. Jack squeezed her hand. Life's funny that way. The most important opportunities often come from unexpected places. Susan nodded, watching as other guests approached Clint on the dance floor, clearly eager to speak with him. Despite his fame and success, he had taken the time to help her, a relative nobody who had been disrespectful to him. I think I need to watch more of his films, she said. Not just because he was nice to me, but because I clearly missed something important in them the first time around. We can start when we get home, Jack suggested. Have a Clint Eastwood movie marathon, Susan smiled. I'd like that. She looked down at the invitation card Clint had given her, still hardly able to believe it was real. And then we'll go to that screening in New York and thank him properly. As the evening continued, Susan found herself enjoying the gala in a different way than she had anticipated. Instead of anxiously trying to meet as many important people as possible, she relaxed and engaged in genuine conversations with those around her. And strangely enough, this more authentic approach seemed to attract more people to her. By the End of the night. Her small clutch was full of business cards from people interested in her designs. When it was time to leave, Susan spotted Clint near the exit, saying his goodbyes to the hosts. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach him again. But he saw her and Jack and gave them a friendly nod. "Remember," he said as they passed, "New York, next month. My assistant will be in touch with the details." "We'll be there," Susan promised. "And Mr. Eastwood, thank you. Not just for the invitation, but for being so kind after I was so ... Water under the bridge," he said simply. Sometimes the most interesting relationships start with a misunderstanding. As Susan and Jack stepped out into the cool London night, she realized that this evening had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. She had come to the gala hoping to climb the social ladder. Instead, she had learned a valuable lesson about humility, grace, and the unexpected places where opportunity could be found. And it had all started with her making the biggest social blunder of her life. 1 month later, Susan and Jack stood outside a small, exclusive theater in New York City. The marquee displayed no title, just "private screening" in simple letters. Susan checked the invitation card one more time, though she had memorized the details weeks ago. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she asked nervously. Jack nodded. "This is the address. And look, there's a security guard checking names at the door." Susan took a deep breath. After returning from London, she had immersed herself in Clint Eastwood's films. She watched his early westerns, his police dramas, and his more recent directorial work. With each film, she gained a new appreciation for his talent, both in front of and behind the camera. The subtle emotional moments, the careful framing of shots, the powerful performances he drew from actors, she had missed so much when watching these films as a teenager. "I still can't believe he invited us after how I behaved," Susan said, adjusting her dress. She had chosen to wear one of her own designs tonight, a simple but elegant black dress that she hoped struck the right balance between professional and stylish. "That's just the kind of person he seems to be," Jack said. "Generous and forgiving." They approached the entrance, where a man in a suit checked their names against a list. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" "Yes, you're on Mr. Eastwood's personal guest list. Please go inside and take any seats in the reserved section in the center." The theater was small but luxurious, with comfortable leather seats and excellent sightlines to the screen. Despite arriving 20 minutes before the scheduled start time, the room was already half full of people in elegant attire, quietly chatting in small groups. Susan recognized several famous actors and directors among them. "Jack," she whispered, "that's Martin Scorsese over there. And isn't that Meryl Streep?" Jack nodded, looking equally starstruck. "This is definitely a high-profile screening. I feel a little out of place." "Me too," Susan admitted. "Let's just find our seats and try not to make eye contact with anyone." They made their way to the reserved section and found seats in the middle of a row. Susan noticed that several seats around them remained empty while the rest of the theater continued to fill. Just as the lights began to dim, there was a small commotion at the entrance. Susan turned to see Clint Eastwood entering with a small group of people. Even in the darkening room, she could see that he carried himself with the same quiet dignity she had observed at the gala. He scanned the room briefly, then made his way directly to their section. To Susan's surprise, he slid into the empty seat right beside her. "Susan, Jack, glad you could make it." "Mr. Eastwood," Susan said, trying to keep her voice steady, "thank you for inviting us. We wouldn't have missed it." "Clint, please," he said with a small smile. "Did you have a good flight from Chicago?" "Yes." "Very smooth," Jack replied. "We're only staying the weekend, but we're excited to be here." Before they could say more, the lights dimmed completely and the screen lit up. There was no introduction, no preliminary speeches. The film simply began, drawing them immediately into its world. Susan found herself completely absorbed in the story. It was a drama about an aging horse trainer trying to save his family ranch while reconnecting with his estranged daughter. The cinematography was stunning, capturing the harsh beauty of the American West. The performances were subtle and powerful, with moments of humor balancing the emotional weight of the story. Occasionally, Susan glanced sideways at Clint, wondering what it must be like to watch your own work with an audience. His face revealed nothing, but she noticed how he carefully observed the reactions of those around him when particularly important scenes played. When the film ended 2 hours later, there was a moment of silence before the audience erupted into applause. The lights came up, and people began turning to each other, discussing what they had just seen. Susan turned to Clint, genuinely moved by the film. "That was beautiful," she said sincerely. The relationship between the father and daughter. "It felt so real," Clint nodded, seeming pleased by her reaction. "Family is complicated. That's what interested me about the story." The scene where they finally talk about her mother's death. Jack added, "That was powerful." "Thank you," Clint said. "The actors gave me everything in that scene." People began approaching their row, congratulating Clint and discussing technical aspects of the film. Susan and Jack sat quietly, not wanting to intrude on these industry conversations. After a while, Clint turned back to them. "There's a small reception upstairs," he said. "Nothing fancy. Would you like to join us?" Susan was surprised by the invitation. "Are you sure? We don't want to impose." "I invited you, didn't I?" Clint said with that familiar small smile. "Besides, there's someone I'd like you to meet." They followed him up a curved staircase to a large room where servers circulated, with trays of drinks and small appetizers. The crowd was smaller here, mostly people who seemed to have worked on the film. Clint led them through the room to where a young woman in her 20s stood talking to a cinematographer. "Kate," Clint called softly. The young woman turned, her face lighting up when she saw him. She excused herself from her conversation and came over. "What did you think?" she asked eagerly. "Audience seemed to like it," Clint said modestly. "Kate, I'd like you to meet Susan and Jack Miller. Susan is the designer I told you about." "Susan, Jack, this is my granddaughter, Kate." The young woman extended her hand with a warm smile. "Grandpa mentioned meeting you at the gala. He said you had a memorable conversation about his films." Susan felt her face flush, wondering exactly how Clint had described their memorable conversation. But Kate's smile was genuine, without any hint of mockery. "That's one way to put it," Susan said with an embarrassed laugh. "Your grandfather was very gracious about my strong opinions," Kate laughed. "He likes people who speak their mind. Always has." She glanced at her grandfather with obvious affection. "So you're a fashion designer? Grandpa said you just opened a store in London?" "Yes." Susan nodded. "Miller Designs. We're still small, but growing." "I'm studying fashion design at Parsons," Kate said. "That's actually why Grandpa wanted us to meet. He thought I might learn something from talking with someone who's already established their own brand." Susan was touched that Clint had remembered her profession and thought to connect her with his granddaughter. "I'd be happy to share what I've learned, though I'm still figuring things out myself." They found a quiet corner where Susan and Kate could talk. As the evening progressed, Susan shared stories about starting her business, the challenges of breaking into the industry, and lessons she had learned along the way. Kate asked thoughtful questions and shared her own design ideas. Jack and Clint stood a short distance away, occasionally glancing over at the two women, deep in conversation. "Your wife has a good eye," Clint commented. "Kate doesn't connect with just anyone when it comes to design." "Susan's passionate about her work," Jack said proudly. "Sometimes too passionate, as you discovered at the gala," Clint chuckled. "Passion is never a bad thing, as long as it's paired with talent. She seems to have both." "Thank you for this," Jack said seriously. "Not just the invitation tonight, but for being so kind to Susan after, well, you know, Clint shrugged. Life's too short to hold grudges. Besides, I got a good story out of it. As the reception began to wind down, Kate and Susan rejoined them. Kate was holding one of Susan's business cards and looking excited. Susan's invited me to visit her studio next time I'm in Chicago, she told her grandfather. She's going to show me how she develops her seasonal collections. Sounds like a good opportunity, Clint said, clearly pleased by his granddaughter's enthusiasm. As they prepared to leave, Susan faced Clint one last time. I don't know how to thank you enough, she said. For the invitation, for introducing me to Kate, for everything. No thanks needed, Clint said. Just keep making good designs and speaking your mind. The world has enough people who just say what others want to hear. Susan nodded, finally understanding why this legendary figure had taken an interest in her. Despite her social blunder, in his own quiet way, he valued the same qualities in others that had made him successful: honesty, passion, and the courage to stand by one's vision. As they left the building and stepped into the busy New York night, Jack put his arm around Susan's shoulders. So, was this trip worth it? Susan thought about everything that had happened since that moment of horrible recognition at the gala, the lessons she had learned, the connections she had made, and the new perspective she had gained on her own career and values. More than worth it, she said. You know, when Prince William said Clint's name that night, I thought it was the worst moment of my life. Now I think it might have been one of the best. Jack smiled. Just goes to show you never know where a mistake might lead. Susan nodded, remembering Clint's words from the gala. Sometimes the most interesting relationships start with a misunderstanding. As they hailed a taxi to take them back to their hotel, Susan made a mental note to send a thank you gift to Clint Eastwood, not just for his kindness to her, but for the reminder that true grace meant treating others with dignity, even when they didn't deserve it. That was a lesson worth more than any business connection or royal introduction could ever be.